You have to understand the man to understand the music, and with Elvis, the man was a walking contradiction. He was the king of rock and roll. He was a good old boy from Tupelo, Mississippi. He was a global superstar who felt desperately alone. He was a symbol of rebellion who loved his mother and his country. And at the heart of it all, he was a sinner who desperately wanted to be a saint. This conflict lived in him every day. It fueled his performances, it tormented his private life, and it poured out of him in his gospel music. That wasn't a sideline for him. It wasn't a commercial gimmick, it was the bedrock, it was the music he sang before he was famous, and it was the music he sang in the middle of the night, long after the stadiums were empty and the applause had faded. It was his direct line to something he was terrified of losing. So, when you ask if his faith was wavering when he sang a certain gospel song, the answer isn't simple. It's not a yes or a no, it's more complicated. To see it clearly, you have to look at where he was in his life. The year was 1971. The 1960s were over. The clean-cut movie era was done. The triumphant 68 comeback special was in the rearview mirror. He was now the king of Las Vegas. On the surface, this was the peak. He was selling out every show. He was making more money than ever. He was Elvis Presley, a living legend in a white jumpsuit. But behind the scenes, a different story was unfolding. The Vegas life was a trap. It was a gilded cage. Every night was the same show. Every day was spent sealed off from the world in a hotel suite. He was surrounded by his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, but he was profoundly lonely. His marriage to Priscilla was crumbling. He was barely seeing his daughter. He was battling a dangerous dependence on prescription drugs to get him up, bring him down, and help him sleep. He was physically starting to decline. The trim, electric energy of the comeback special was being replaced by a heavier, more weary presence. He was a prisoner of his own fame. He was shackled. He was carrying a heavy burden. He was lost in the dark. This is the man who walked into RCA's Studio B in Nashville in May of 1971. He wasn't there to record another pop hit for the radio. He wasn't there to fulfill a contractual obligation. He was there because he needed to be. He decided he was going to record a gospel album. He needed to connect with the one thing that had always felt real, always felt true, since he was a little boy. His love for this music was bone deep. It started in the Small Assembly of God church in Tupelo. He and his parents, Vernon and Gladys, would sit in the pews, and the music would wash over them. It wasn't quiet, respectful hymn singing. It was loud, it was passionate, it was people clapping, stomping, and singing with their whole bodies. It was music filled with desperation and deliverance, with sin and salvation. It was emotional, it was raw. A young Elvis absorbed it all. He saw how music could move people, how it could lift them up and give them hope. It was his first musical education. Gladys, his mother, was the center of his world, and her faith was a central part of her. She instilled in him a belief in God, a fear of sin, and a deep love for gospel hymns. When he was a teenager in Memphis, he'd go to the all-night gospel sings at Ellis Auditorium. He'd watch groups like the Blackwood Brothers and the Statesman Quartet. He studied them. He learned their harmonies, their phrasing, their stage presence. This was the music he truly idolized. Rock and roll made him famous, but gospel music was his heart. Then came the explosion of the 1950s. He was suddenly a phenomenon. And with that fame came condemnation. Preachers across the country called his music sinful, the devil's work. They said his swiveling hips were corrupting the youth of America. This must have created a terrible conflict inside him. He was a boy who loved God, who loved his mama, and who was being told by men of God that he was evil. He was just doing what felt natural, singing the music that moved him, a blend of the gospel, blues, and country he'd grown up on. But the world was telling him it was wrong. This was the beginning of the split. The public Elvis, the rebel, and the private Elvis, the gospel boy. The death of his mother in 1958 shattered him. It was the great trauma of his life. He lost his anchor, his faith was tied so closely to her, and now she was gone. It's a moment from which he never truly recovered. A part of his spiritual foundation was ripped away. The army, the movies of the 60s, he was drifting, he was making films he hated, singing songs he didn't believe in. He felt like a commodity, a product. During this time, he began a frantic spiritual search. He wasn't just a simple Bible-believing Christian anymore. He was reading everything he could get his hands on. He devoured books on religion, philosophy, and mysticism. The Impersonal Life, Autobiography of a Yogi. Books about numerology, the occult, different belief systems. He was looking for answers. He was trying to figure out his purpose. Why him? Why was he chosen for this incredible fame? What was he supposed to do with it? He would talk for hours with his friends, especially his hairdresser, Larry Geller, about God and the meaning of life. He was a seeker. He was a man adrift looking for a lighthouse in a storm. This search shows that his faith wasn't gone. It was just confused. It was complicated. He was trying to reconcile the simple faith of his childhood with the complex, often painful reality of his adult life. That's the man who showed up in that Nashville studio. He was tired. He was lonely. He was confused. He was in pain. And he was reaching for the one thing that had never let him down: gospel music. The sessions were powerful. He was surrounded by musicians who understood this music, including his hero, J.D. Sumner, and the Stamps Quartet. They would gather around the piano between takes and just sing the old hymns for hours. It was a release for him. It was church. Then they got to a particular song. It was a newer one, written a few years earlier by a man named William J. Gaither. The lyrics were a testimony. They told a story of a life weighed down by sin and despair. A life that was empty and broken. The singer cries out, asking if there's anything more to life than this pain. And then, a hand reaches down. A touch brings healing and wholeness. You have to imagine Elvis reading those lyrics in 1971. Shackled by a heavy burden, neath a load of guilt and shame. This was his life. The burden of being Elvis Presley. The guilt he carried over his failing marriage, his drug use, his distance from his own soul. Then the hand of Jesus touched me, and now I am no longer the same. This was his hope. This was the deliverance he craved. The simple, transformative power of grace that he learned about as a boy. When he stepped up to the microphone to sing, it wasn't a performance. It was a confession. It was a prayer. You can hear it in his voice. There's a raw ache in the opening lines. He's not just singing words on a page, he's living them. He sounds weary, he sounds broken. So was his faith wavering? Look at it this way. Faith isn't always about certainty. It's not about standing on a mountaintop and shouting your beliefs with confidence. Sometimes, faith is what you do when you're in the valley. It's what you do when you're lost in the dark, and all you can do is whisper a prayer, hoping someone is listening. Sometimes, faith is an act of desperation. The way he sang that song was an act of desperate faith. He wasn't singing from a place of spiritual strength. He was singing from a place of profound spiritual need. He was a man drowning, and this song was his hand reaching up for a lifeline. The very act of singing it was an affirmation of belief. He was reminding himself of the truth he needed to believe in. That redemption was possible. That he wasn't too far gone, that he could be made whole again. The wavering wasn't in his belief in God. The wavering was in his belief in himself. He felt he had strayed too far, he felt unworthy. The performance is so powerful because it's so honest. He's not pretending to be a perfect Christian. He's laying his soul bare. He is singing as a broken man, clinging to the promise of being fixed. You hear his voice build throughout the song. It starts with that quiet, heavy weariness. But as he sings about the touch that changed everything, a power comes into his voice. It swells. The background singers come in, lifting him up. It becomes a declaration. By the end of the song, he is soaring. He is testifying. He is not just singing the story, he is trying to experience it right there in that studio. He is trying to will that healing touch into his own life through the act of singing. So no, his faith wasn't wavering in the sense that he was about to abandon it. His faith was being tested by fire, and his performance of this song was him fighting back. It was him in the middle of the battle, not surrendering, but calling for reinforcement. It was one of the most honest and vulnerable moments of his entire recording career. He stripped away the jumpsuit, the swagger, the persona of the king, and he was just Elvis. A man who was in pain and was singing his way back to hope. The album won him his second Grammy Award. It was a critical and spiritual success for him, but it didn't solve his problems. The paradox of his life continued. He would sing these incredible songs of faith on stage, moving thousands of people to tears. And then he would go back to his hotel suite and the isolation and the pills. The final years are hard to look at. The physical decline was stark. The man who was once a symbol of youthful rebellion became a bloated, tragic figure. But even then, the gospel music was there. His friends and bandmates have countless stories of him sitting at a piano late at night, in a hotel room somewhere on the road, long after a show was over. He'd be exhausted, but he would play and sing the old hymns. How great thou art. Peace in the valley. It was his comfort, it was his medication, it was the only thing that seemed to quiet the noise in his head. When he was on stage, even in those last years when his speech could be slurred and his movements slow, something would happen when he sang a gospel song. A clarity would return, a focus, a fire would light up in his eyes. He would connect with that music, and for those 3 or 4 minutes, he was saved. He was back in that little church in Tupelo. He was whole. The question of his wavering faith is the central question of his life. He wrestled with it every day. He was a man who had everything the world could offer, and he knew it wasn't enough. He knew true peace came from somewhere else. He just had a hard time living there. Now, his performance on that one song in 1971 is maybe the clearest window we have into that struggle. It's not the sound of a man whose faith is weak or disappearing. It's the sound of a man whose faith is all he has left. It's the sound of a man holding on for dear life. It's the sound of a cry from the depths, a desperate, beautiful, and profoundly human prayer. The song was called "He Touched Me."